Hello, everyone. I am Daniel with Pluralsight, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. Before we get into the meat of the presentation, I just want to share a couple of quick notes and housekeeping tips for those who are joining us today. First, we are going to be taking questions. So as you're viewing the presentation today and you think of a good question, be sure to drop that in the question box in Zoom, and then we will get to those questions at the end. If you run into any issues where your audio isn't playing or things are breaking up, the best way to troubleshoot that is to just rejoin the presentation. That usually resolves most issues. Check your bandwidth, your internet connection, those sorts of things. Those are usually the top culprits if you're having a hard time viewing the presentation. And then one other question we get a lot is, are we recording? And we are recording, and everyone here that has joined us, you will receive an email in the next couple days with a link to the recording so you can rewatch it or share it with a colleague. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Raquel Breternitz. Raquel is an award-winning designer, a speaker, a writer. She's passionate about inclusion, accessibility, and keeping tech human-focused. Most recently, she worked as the design director for the Elizabeth Warren campaign. And with that, I won't continue to talk because you're not here to listen to me. You're here to listen to Raquel. And so I will turn it over to her.
Thank you, Daniel. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today as I talk about how to build inclusive and accessible products. And I consider this not just a descriptive title, but an imperative title. We must all build inclusive products and accessible products, and products that consider more than an imagined median user. And more on that later. But suffice to say, it's pretty simple. Everyone should be able to use your software. Everyone. I want to start actually with a quick design prompt. If you have a notepad around, a pen, kind of dig around your desk wherever you are, and take a couple minutes to think about how you would design a wheelchair ramp. I will sit here and watch you. I know it's unusual, but if you don't have anything to draw with, just kind of see if you can be creative and imagine it as well. And I'm going to cut it a little short because I feel weird sitting in silence. But usually I have people share. I would love it if people would perhaps use the Q&A function to share a little bit of, or maybe the chat function, share a little bit about what you're thinking about as you're designing this wheelchair ramp, or describe the wheelchair ramp that you've designed.
Raquel, I'll jump in and say, like, in my kind of quick design prompt, like the wheelchair ramp, I imagine is very basic. It's like a wedge. I don't know, just like a straight. It's like the most simple concept of a ramp that I could kind of think of. I guess that's the one that came to me.
Sure, the classic.
Yeah.
Thanks, Daniel. I'll move on. Let's take another little bit of time and design a better way for both wheeled and walking people to enter a conference hall. Again, you can just kind of sit and think about that a little bit. Daniel, I might call on you again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do see a couple of people have weighed in with theirs as well. Just want to make sure you can see those.
I actually cannot.
Okay. Let me read them for you. So let's see. Anonymous attendee said, I ended up designing more flexible wheels for different terrain. So that's how they were kind of thinking about this.
Hmm.
And then James said, handrails, low slope, curving back and forth as needed, level stopping points, bumps for users who are blind, color awareness. Wow, James just, in my opinion, did way better than I did with my stupid single ramp. But those are, oh, one other. Oh, yes. So Brian mentioned chat is disabled, but yeah, just use the Q&A box to share like everyone's doing. That's great. Morgan said, I started drawing two different approaches. Then I thought, why not just draw one ramp for both walking and wheeled? So I guess they were thinking about the two and then combine them.
I love that. Thank you for sharing, everyone. Those are all like pretty good ideas. And I hope that you felt a little bit of the difference between those two prompts. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of what's happening here, where this prompt, design a wheelchair ramp, is telling you the answer already, like give us a ramp. Whereas this prompt is actually telling you the goal. We want people to come into this conference hall, and those people can come from all different walks of life or wheels of life, so to speak. And so when you start considering the problem from that perspective, you can get a lot more creative solutions. And I hope you experience that even this little design prompt that you just went through. And so I do that to illustrate that it's not enough to just be accessible. I think a lot of times people can come at accessibility or hear about it for the first time from a compliance mindset. There's a law or a rule that they have to follow, and so they just try to follow it without thinking about the larger context that it lives within. So I want to show a little bit of an example of what that might look like in the world. So both of these ramps are technically accessible. However, this one is a compliance-based accessibility on the left. And it's basically what you might see a lot of, kind of a add-on ramp. It looks like it's kind of just tacked on at the back of a random building. I can't imagine I would know how to find this ramp. It doesn't look like it's in the front or in any sort of easily accessible position. It looks difficult to navigate. It's got those complicated railings and that kind of curve situation. Could even be dangerous. I don't personally feel interested in walking down that alley, particularly not at night. And we can contrast this with this ramp design on the right. And I don't want to indicate that this ramp design is the correct one. There's nothing is ever perfect, but it comes at it from a much more inclusive approach. It's directly in the front of conference hall. This is, I think, in Sweden somewhere, if I recall correctly. It's easy to find, easy to use. You can come at it the way that you think is best, so you can use it as steps or as a ramp. It's also helpful for anyone coming at the conference hall with different types of wheels, so not just a wheelchair, but a baby carriage, a scooter, maybe you're rolling some luggage, maybe you're carrying your bike up to be able to lock it up closer to the entrance. And it's also beautiful. And I think that's another thing that is overlooked very often in a compliance mindset accessibility approach that really breaks my heart, because beauty is not only for the able-bodied. Beauty is a human right. So why is it like this? A lot of it is based on some historical approaches, and I want to talk a little bit about that. So there's a architect named Le Corbusier. If you, like me, went to art school, you may have learned about him. He was a French architect who started kind of high modernism. And he actually created something he called Le Moduleur, which is an able-bodied man of what he considered average height and dimension, around whom he could revolve his standardized ideas of design. Unfortunately, what that ended up being is that precedent was set for a default that doesn't actually include a whole lot of people. So you can imagine the outcome. A lot of different disabled people with different bodies than the imagined default, have been shut out of buildings and in some places of their basic rights. There are people who can't get into their halls of justice, people who can't access, mobile banking or ATMs. Some people that can't even find a good spot to get off the street. So you can imagine the response. Protesters took to the streets. A lot of them began actually smashing curbs to create their own accessible ramps. You may be familiar with the story of curb cuts, but many of those curb cuts that you see now that allow you to kind of ramp in and out of sidewalks onto the street were initially created by activists, kind of taking things into their own hands. Other activists actually would literally pour concrete over the cover of night to create their own accessible ramps. A lot of this happened in Berkeley. It was really cool. People took matters in their own hands because they weren't gaining access to the same places that sort of able-bodied people were. And it's time to do the same thing with inaccessible software. There are lots of softwares that also allow you access to your halls of justice, software that allows you access to banking, software that just lets you get around the internet, and that's just as inaccessible, and it's time for that to change. So I want to start and talk a little bit about some myths about digital accessibility that you may have encountered, or you may have heard, or maybe subconsciously think that's in some piece of your mind from living in the world. The myth number one is the idea that accessibility is a fringe need. It's only for a very small subset of people, and that's not my users, and I don't need to really care about that right now. The reality is disability isn't inherent to one person. We all experience disability at different points in time. So have you ever been driving a car and needed to look up directions with one hand and kind of glancing over? Have you ever kind of lay in bed and tried to use your app one-handed? Or if you're like me, you have a cat that really enjoys taking over at least one of your arms. Have you ever kind of walked out of a car and you have glasses and it's cold out and you get fogged up and you can't quite see for a minute? Have you ever tried to work with a migraine, or maybe in a really loud coffee shop? Or maybe you've been trying to look and read something on your screen with the full sun on it. Have you ever been traveling and needed to try to figure out software in a foreign country? Are you personally aging? If any of those things are true, I have news for you. You have experienced disability. There's a definition of disability that is more current, that has been defined by the World Health Organization as a mismatched interaction between the features of a person's body and the features of the environment in which they live. And I really appreciate this point of view of the mismatch. It also comes from, there's a book called Mismatch by Kat Holmes, who founded the Inclusive Design Toolkit at Microsoft and I believe is now at Google. She's a worthwhile person to follow along. But I think that's an essential way to rethink our models of disability and the ways we think about disability. Because when we start considering things as mismatches, you'll discover that every single user that you can possibly encounter will experience something like this, and you can address it in your design by approaching it inclusively. So speaking of Kat Holmes, these are some illustrations from the Inclusive Design Toolkit from Microsoft, and they kind of show a little bit the different forms of disability any one of us can experience throughout any point of time. So you could have a permanent disability in that you may have lost your arm. You can have a temporary disability in that you have an arm injury, or you can have a situational disability. And let's say you're a new parent and you're holding your baby. There are all kinds of spectrums of that experience that any of us might have for any different senses or abilities. So seeing, hearing, speaking, smelling even, though that can be less relevant for digital software. And the reality is that we are not all modular. There's actually no average person. There's this great story of the Air Force was looking to redesign one of their pilots' chairs. There's a book about this that I don't recall the title of now, but you can look it up. The Air Force was looking to redesign one of their pilots' chairs. So They surveyed all of the pilots that they had and designed a chair to perfectly fit the exact median. And when they implemented this chair that they designed, kind of based on the very perfect average of every pilot in the Air Force, crashes went up significantly. And they were really confused as to why. And they went and they looked at it and they measured it. And can you guess what percentage of the Air Force actually fit that chair? It was actually 0. Not a single pilot fit that perfect average, because the reality is, while a law of averages can be helpful in some contexts, there is no average person. That average person does not exist. And so if we design for that, we're designing for an imaginary user. What the Air Force ended up doing instead was to survey their kind of shortest, squattest pilot, tallest, thinnest pilot, and like finding the kind of extremes of build within the context of the Air Force, and designing a chair that could be flexible and adjustable across the board. And that was a much, much more efficient and an effective chair for their pilots. And so that kind of is a great story that I think perfectly encapsulates this principle, which is that solving for the extremes does make better products for all. Because if you solve for something that can both encompass this side of an extreme and this side of an extreme, it actually covers the whole center, as opposed to designing just for that perfect median, which is a very small slice. So it's not that there's a user who is capable and a user that is not capable. It's a spectrum of capabilities across the board. And there's this reality that solving for the extremes of that spectrum allows us to make better solutions for everyone. So the well actually to this myth is that we will all need different levels of access, whether it's now or later. So I kind of tell these things to a little bit point out the obvious that maybe we haven't been thinking about, which is that able-bodiedness, whatever that means, is actually a temporary state. We will all need differing levels of access at some point in our lives, and probably at many. Another myth is that accessibility takes too long. So it's not, let's say, an MVP-friendly business priority. I've heard this a lot in agile contexts. And so if you're not familiar, MVP means most viable product. It's kind of the sense that you make the smallest effective thing that brings you value. And I've heard very often that accessibility isn't included in that. To which I answer, if something is not accessible, in what way are you arguing that it is viable? And secondly, what are your business priorities? It might be time for a reshift. Because the reality is, if you make that decision, whether you're building enterprise products or not, you are telling every single one of these people on this slide that they don't deserve to use your software. If that's an enterprise product, then you're saying that these people don't deserve to be hired to work on something that uses your software. If it's a consumer product, you're cutting out an entire group of users. And again, this is not just kind of these immediate people who have disabilities. It's also anyone who experiences temporary or situational disabilities that align with this as well. If you're shutting out the ability for people to hire folks who are disabled, you might also be, well, breaking the law. And the reality is that as of 2018, so this has gone up, the discretionary income for working age people with disabilities is around $21 billion. That's bigger than the African American and Hispanic market segments combined. I say that from a financial perspective because obviously there are many African American and Hispanic and every other type of person under the group of people with disabilities. But thinking through things through a market segment, if you have to come at it from that perspective, this is a significant amount of money that you are leaving on the table. It is also besides the nearly $15 trillion of the annual spending power of older adults in the United States. Not small priority markets by any means. So why are their needs considered minor considerations? It's also the law. Again, as of 2019, there was so many lawsuits based on the ADA, which is the American Disabilities Act, that there was basically one lawsuit every hour. It has increased year over year over year. And so if you haven't been burned by this yet, there's a high likelihood that you might be. And I love to come at it from another architect's point of view here, quotation. You can use an eraser on the drafting table or a sledgehammer on a construction site. It's always less costly to be considering accessibility and inclusion from the beginning than having to address it later on after you've been called out or you've been sued or you're trying to expand your market segment. It really pays to do the work in the design and development phase rather than try to stick it in last minute. So the well actually of this myth is that the best workers and users will not fit your default, much like the pilot's chair. There's also a myth that accessibility makes design uglier and graphs harder. I've experienced this personally with a lot of junior designers that I've worked in and in my own career growing up. But the reality is that trends shift and trends change. I love this article that came out actually in 2016, but it's still a problem of how the red became unreadable. And there was this great quote from this author that read, "I thought my eyesight was beginning to go, but it turns out I'm suffering from design." Suffering from design does not to me say good design. He goes on, "It's been getting harder for me to read things on my phone and my laptop. I've caught myself squinting and holding the screen closer to my face. These hurdles have made me grumpy over time, but what pushed me over the edge was Google's App Engine console." And he goes on and talks about how the text that he had been using daily changed from legible to illegible, all based on a web trend. I found, this is a personal experience, but I found over time as I was trying to design that when I didn't know how to make something have enough white space or enough balance in the composition, that I covered that up by making it lighter rather than pushing myself to find a better design principle in the first place. It's not always true, but I think we need to be very careful of design and visual trends that end up being inaccessible. There's also a great example of accessibility actually helping. This is Peter Kaczmarek. He is actually a colorblind designer with a fellow designer, Julie Rodriguez. They designed one of the kind of standout examples of how to create financial data visualizations from some time ago, but are still considered a web standard. And one of the amazing things that they were able to do is used his color blocks in order to create graphs that he can understand that actually made them much more understandable at a glance across the board. They were required to use clean type. They were required to undermine sort of the muddy grays and to use hierarchy, as well as to use successful contrast rather than relying on color. Overall, accessibility can be considered a generative constraint for better design work rather than something that gets away of your pretty design. So the will actually there is that the best design in reality is the one that works the best, not the one that looks the nicest. And I'd like to posit that you can have both. And in fact, you can make much more beautiful things if you consider accessibility within it. I don't want to, brag about myself, but this entire presentation I like to think is relatively good looking for a presentation and is completely accessible. So you might be wondering at this point, okay, I'm sold, I've understood these myths, but what do I do now? So I'd like to provide with a few guidelines. The solution, number one, is just to diversify your teams. You've probably heard this a million times, but it's a truth that diverse teams build better and more inclusive products. It creates a space for divergent perspectives that are essential to innovation. And I'd like to push that if you are creating software for disabled people to use, why aren't you including disabled people on your teams? As designers, we have to be honest about the limits of empathy and solving for the wrong problems because we're solving for people and not with them. There is a disability advocate named Liz Jackson who has come up with the idea of the disability dongle, which she defines as a well-intended, elegant, yet useless solution to a problem we never knew we had. Disability dongles, she says very sassily, are most often conceived of and created in design schools and at IDEO. So she has a little bit of sass, but she has a good point in that a lot of times we say, okay, great, here's this problem that I want to solve and I'm empathetic and I can solve it by myself, rather than actually bringing in disabled people as co-creators of their solutions. Because truly, as Liz Jackson has also said in a New York Times article, disabled people are the original life hackers. They have created innovations that we have never had to consider. One example of these things from Alice Wong, another wonderful disability advocate that I recommend following, is this idea of this kind of super amazing wheelchair prototype that could climb stairs, which is cool. It's a cool idea. What it isn't is accessible because it's a prototype and it's extremely expensive to make. And it's focused on one person, the disabled person, to solve their personal mismatch rather than just making the stairs accessible, which not only helps every disabled person, but every abled person as well. Every temporarily abled person, as Alice would say. We have to take a look at ourselves and ask, am I excluding people by not considering them? Is my workplace and my work excluding people because it's designing for and not with? And I think that's a very serious question that we should all ask ourselves. We need to hire disabled designers because, again, they are the original life hackers. They have these divergent perspectives that we need in our teams. And we need to create solutions together alongside the experts who are disabled people themselves. Solution number 2 is to stand on the shoulders of giants. There are tons and tons of resources out there, including guides by industry leaders. There are blogs, both personal and professional. There's entire YouTube channels, you know, the blind programmer and how he works. There's a vibrant and thriving Twitter culture. It's totally worth taking an afternoon and starting to research and starting to build places to look, to hear voices directly from disabled people and people who have created accessible and inclusive products. A few guides that I've personally enjoyed or had a part of or used include IBM, who just put out their own ability toolkit. There's the Microsoft Inclusive Toolkit that I mentioned earlier as well. If you work in content, the Vox Accessibility Toolkit is super valuable, and I really recommend it across the board because it covers language questions that a lot of other guides don't. And then if you work in government and you do actually have to consider 508 compliance laws, the 18F Accessibility Guide approaches that inclusively, but also with a specific interest on government accessibility and what that looks like. So highly recommend those. Sorry. Solution number 3 is to consider inclusion as a team sport. This can feel really overwhelming. I'm kind of throwing a lot at you right now, and it can feel like, how could I possibly do by myself? The good thing is you don't have to. You should get everyone involved. It isn't just a responsibility of the designer, but also of the product manager, also of the developer. Designers, you know, you can make sure that from the very beginning, every color scheme that you create has significant contrast and that fonts are big enough to read and that your type hierarchy is correct. Developers can make sure that every link is keyboard accessible and makes sense when you're tabbing through. Researchers can seek out disabled testers and users to research and evaluate products from an accessibility perspective. Project and product managers can build in accessibility reviews into your delivery plan. Every single one of us on a team can be advocates, and every single one of us can find something that we can own that can push accessibility forward. And solution number 4 is to build up your own expertise. there's lots of tips. There's reflexes that you can pull up. Things that I always check for is there alt text on an image? Is the tab order sensible? Are there hover styles that are hiding something behind them? So if someone can't hover, they can't find an action. Is the HTML semantic? You can also find your favorite checklists. I put a few forward earlier. There's also plugins, there's linters, there's ARIA guides, there's the WCAG standards, which are kind of helpful set standards for web accessibility writ large. You can build a posse. Highly recommend making an accessibility Slack channel. A11Y is the kind of short name for digital accessibility that's used kind of throughout the internet. If you're looking for places to search, you can hire and train for accessibility. Hire accessibility literate designers, hire disabled designers, train accessibility literate designers, and hold accessibility focused critiques. And finally, forgive my French, but fuck the golden path. We talked earlier about how there is no real median user. There's also no one who will use your software in a perfect bubble and who will follow your perfect journey. I highly recommend complicating your scenarios. Think of the ways that something that you've designed can be misused to create harm or misused to exclude. Often you'll find way better solutions and way better considerations as you're working through your product when you start thinking in those complicated scenarios versus a golden path scenario. Some more architects and designers quotations for you all. Charles and Ray Eames say that design depends largely on constraints. You may have experienced this to some extent. Your constraints are a gift to a designer because they tell you what you need to be creative around. And I find that accessibility is one of the most fruitful possible constraints for design because it really does push you to create far better, far more usable, far more inclusive work than you would have otherwise, rather than considering it something that you're just sort of focusing for a significant small niche of people. In reality, it creates much better design. I want to kind of end this a little bit on a quote by the great Oliver Sacks, who was a science writer and a wonderful person. And he wrote something that I really have taken to heart, which is, I wish for a world that views disability, mental or physical, not as a hindrance, but as unique attributes that can be seen as powerful assets if given the right opportunities. So never forget, inclusive, accessible design is better for all of us. And thank you very much. I will pause now and allow questions.
Thank you so much, Raquel. That was really cool. I was taking a lot of notes just personally that, a lot of concepts that I've never completely thought of before. So I know I speak for everyone here when I say thanks for that awesome presentation. And yeah, like you said, we will now take some questions. I have a couple that have come in so far, but if you have any, please submit them now to make sure we can fit them in during this webinar period. The first question we got that I will start with, how do I start advocating for these concepts with my business leaders?
Yeah, that's a huge question I get a lot. I think starting to change the perspective on what accessibility is in the ways that I've talked about is a great place to start. I think often it can help a lot to connect to what your business leaders value. And so I like to talk about, you say this tactfully, but you yourself, business leader, are probably aging or on the older spectrum as a leader. You yourself may not be able to use the product we're designing at some point. So that's already connecting it personally. And there's also, the market segment pieces. I recommend trying to empathize with what the business leader is interested in. I think there's also a lot of use in finding allies across the board. So one experience that I had while we're waiting for questions is that I was working really hard at a former company to make our style guide much more accessible. And I ended up just stumbling upon a random forum in our intranet where some salespeople were talking about, why isn't product X accessible? We're trying, like, what's the accessibility level of this? We're trying to sell this to the UK government. We're really not sure what's going on. And that was so exciting to me because what that said to me is that I have allies, and I have allies in sales, which is a powerful ally to have. And so I reached out to them and was able to kind of sit down and talk about my perspective of accessibility. And they were able to help advocate alongside with me up the chain to leadership on multi-level reasons why accessibility is important. So find your allies as well.
This is actually a question that I just have personally. I think you mentioned, like, I think the reason to do this is a result of empathy. It's a result of it being the right thing to do. But there's also this other reason, kind of the, I guess, the stick scenario rather than the carrot, which is like there are lawsuits happening. Is there a reference that of maybe a high profile case or a place you can go to kind of research some of this stuff so you can use that as something to reference in these conversations if you feel like you might need to include that little bit of the stick as along with the carrot in these conversations?
Yes, definitely. One of my favorite examples I like to give is the Beyonce web store was actually sued because a blind person was not able to buy Beyonce merch. And to her credit, Beyonce fixed that pretty quickly. But I'd love to say, if you think you're better than Beyonce, you're wrong. Another example is Domino's Pizza had a very high-profile legal case around a lack of accessibility in their web ordering, and they had to pay a pretty hefty fine, I believe, as well as kind of take steps to fix the problem. I think they're still struggling with that because, again, it can be really hard to bring accessibility in later, though there are good ways to do it. And so just those you can start looking up. I think there are several trackers that you can find kind of through Google that pay attention to how many accessibility websites are happening, accessibility lawsuits are happening, how they're increasing, and how many are specific to digital. And so the ADA is actually, by precedent, been expanded quite a bit to encompass digital things, in particular things like banking, where it can very clearly be argued as exclusionary.
Those are all great examples. Thank you for those. We've got a lot of questions that have come in as you were answering that one. So probably have to kind of keep these answers relatively short if we want to, make time for all of them. First question, any go-to ideation exercises for designing for inclusion?
Yeah, there are lots of things I do just to test. I recommend if you have a Mac, learn how to use VoiceOver. It's the screen reader tool on your Mac, and you can kind of test through anything you're building with VoiceOver. If you're not at the build stage yet, I recommend take your screen outside, sit in the sun, and look at your wireframes and see if they're readable. The keyboard check is always really good. And there's also, I'm going to go back and show this Microsoft Inclusive Design setup as well, because I think this is actually a really fruitful way. I really like to kind of set this up as a grid. So you have your permanent, temporary, situational, you have touch, see, hear, speak, and explore all the ways in which those things could occur in your product within that grid. That can usually be really, really fruitful.
Awesome. Those are all great. Next one from David. What types of research questions, just in case you missed any slides there, hopefully you got a peek at one of those. What types of research questions do you ask from the beginning for designing for accessibility and inclusion?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I prefer to start discovery research just by observation and just paying attention to, I keep saying that disabled people are the original life hackers. And so pay attention. Are there hacks that you see people use? Are there things people are avoiding? I discovered, for example, that there was a blind programmer that could do almost every single thing in our product through the command line interface, but there was one button that needed to be pushed towards the end of his process. And rather than trying to figure out how to get to that button through our like mess of an inaccessible web page, he would just stop and wait for his coworker to be available and ask her to press it. Literally just have his coworker walk over to his office, press a button so he could continue his work. It's not always that stark, but you can observe a lot of things if you just watch. Another thing I like to do is just be straight up of like, you are the expert, I am not. What are the things that frustrate you the most when trying to use the software? And you can see the places that it can come up that are inaccessible. I could go
Great.
on, I'll stop there.
Yeah. Okay. Rogerio, this is a little more of a comment, but I wanted to read it because I think he makes a good point. He said, years ago, there were two books that kind of caught my attention on this subject. One is Why Software Sucks, and another is Don't Make Me Think. Both pointed out that software is normally created by young people in their mid-20s and that they are targeting for themselves. Like you mentioned, people can face disabilities sometime in their life, like having to wear glasses as they get older. So I thought that was a great point. Wanted to share it. Not sure. Don't really need a response there, but good point there. Amanda, they say, I run a book club at my company where we watch training modules on Pluralsight every sprint and then meet to discuss them at the end of the sprint. Is there a particular training course you would recommend for front-end devs to watch to improve their understanding of accessibility while coding? And I saw this question. I have two links that I can drop in that are Pluralsight courses. Both are by Brian Treese. And then I'll drop those in the chat, but I wasn't sure, Raquel, if you had any suggestions. It doesn't need to be Pluralsight. It could be outside of Pluralsight as well.
I was going to say, I know one, but it's not Pluralsight. I apologize. But the one that I even did, even though I understood about a third of it, because I'm a designer, not a developer, is a Udemy course put on by Google, and it's a Google accessibility course. And something I love about it is that they include some of their disabled developers and talking about their perspectives and their approaches, as well as giving really good sort of overall learnings about how to simply make front-end things accessible. So highly recommend that one.
Cool. I'll look, I'll try to track the link down for that one and drop that in the chat if I'm able to find that as well. Kate asks, I work in the EdTech space. Do you have any advice for improving the accessibility of online tools developed for young people?
That's a great question. I don't know a ton from my initial experience, but I would say a lot of the same things that you might consider like larger touch targets are applicable here. I think making things very obvious, how to start them, how to stop them. Kids in particular, I think if you're playing some loud sound or something, they don't want to do it anymore, a very obvious way to stop that. And in general, considering your performance, if the kid doesn't have as good of internet, they may not know how to, troubleshoot that kind of thing. So how can you make sure that what you're doing is loads as easily as possible as well? Some initial thoughts, as always, I kind of rely on, look it up, see if there's other people who have done it, and you can do some research and observe.
I think those are all great points, especially as all of a sudden so many students are working, they're working from home as well. And I've heard a lot of conversations around, especially just considering bandwidth issues and connective, are these students even connected? Are they connected in a way that they can stream a video or not, So great points there. Brittany asked.
I had actually one more thing.
Yeah.
On that note, sometimes the answer is even like, can you go outside of the digital space? Like, are there alternative ways to access this knowledge or this content if someone really can't get their web to work? That's another form of accessibility.
Yeah, that's great. That's literal out of the box thinking, I guess. Brittany asked, how do you recruit for disability research and testing?
Yeah. that can be tricky for sure. I recommend getting help. There's some places that do consulting. One that I used on the Elizabeth Warren campaign is called Perkins School for the Blind. I've also just reached out to, when I've done, worked on software that has clients, reached out to those clients and said, totally up to you, but if there's anyone who's blind or deaf or uses some form of assistive technology, I would love to talk to you and observe how you use our software. Sometimes I've reached out just to local community organizations. Highly recommend compensating in general for user tests, but in particular here. You have to be a little bit careful of legal things, so I recommend kind of getting some legal advice from your counsel, but honestly, you'd be surprised how far you can go just by sort of earnest and honest and open word of mouth. People want to help you, and especially if you're interested in kind of letting them own their own perspective.
Right. I see one more question here, so I just want to do a final call. If you do have a question, this is your chance to drop it in the Q&A box. Amanda asked, as an able-bodied dev learning to use Mac VoiceOver like you recommended, I often worry that I'm not using it in a way that a normal user would. Are there places I can go to learn how a typical user would use VoiceOver, so I don't let my ableness affect my interpretation of how the software is actually being used? Yes,
that is such a great point. Even using the screen reader software is just a proxy. You can't fully ever substitute just observing a real person in the world. That being said, again, I think YouTube is a great place for this. There's also some accessibility conferences. There's a great one I saw that I believe is actually on YouTube, of a blind developer showing his setup, just how he codes. And it's pretty phenomenal how fast they have screen reader software speaking. It's just as an example of something that can be really quite surprising. So I would definitely just try to seek out examples of people showing how they use software. And again, if you can at all, see if you can observe a real person.
We just got in one more question, which is a really good one as well. Maybe it's a good place to end it. Someone asked, for retrofitting an existing app that is not accessible, is there a particular area of accessibility that you would suggest starting with? Example, color contrast, text size, keyboard navigation, or something else? That's a great question.
That is a great question. Yes, I think it depends on your software, but usually where I always start is semantic HTML, just switching everything you possibly can to be semantic HTML, because a lot of accessibility features are baked into the semantic elements, and input forms. Forms are everywhere on the web, and they're extraordinarily inaccessible, and you can clean up so very much just by fixing your forms. If you happen to have a component library, highly recommend just sweeping through it and cleaning those up and cleaning up the color contrast on that, because you can solve a lot of problems at once, and then kind of focus on the gnarlier ones of kind of experience. But yeah, that would be where I started.
That's great. And with that, I think we're out of questions. Thank you everyone for participating. A lot of great questions. I just wanted to remind everyone, maybe if you joined a little bit late, that we did record today's session, and you should receive an email with a link to the recording, probably tomorrow, maybe Monday, but in the next couple of days for sure. And we also have other webinars going on, usually every couple of weeks through Pluralsight. So you can literally just, Google Pluralsight webinars and you'll see what's coming up. And with that, Raquel, I wanted to give you the opportunity to maybe share one final takeaway, next steps, anything you kind of want to leave the attendees with here today.
Yeah, I think one thing that I like to impress upon everyone is that you don't have to do everything at once, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Even small efforts to improve the accessibility just in what you do every day, not writ large across your organization, even useful and meaningful, and moves the needle, and then you can start kind of pushing further. And so don't feel like you can't even start because you can't do it all. Just start incorporating it, even just in your own practice, and it can help a lot already. I always believe, done is better than perfect, and um, all together we can collectively make things more accessible, even with just that. I also want to add, I am super online and super available. My Twitter is Raquel Designs. I'm always down to answer questions or give resources, share other people and voices that I listen to. I have an accessibility Twitter list that I highly recommend following that has a lot of accessibility and disabled advocates. I love to just listen to people's own experiences directly from them. And so recommend that as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. And thanks again to everyone that joined us and participated. And everyone here, please have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.